Hey everybody, it's Lori and I'm here with my November reading wrap up. I read 12 books, audio essays, manga. I'm just counting them all as books because I don't know what else to call them in the month of November. So I'm just going to go from my lowest rated up to my highest rated. I have quite a few 4 stars and several 5 stars, so I don't know that they're going to be any particular order exactly, but anyway, that's what I'm going to do. So to start off, we have my lowest rated book, and it's the manga. I checked out this bind up of volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Full Metal Alchemist from our regional library. This is one that so many people have just raved about, that I've watched videos about. People who really like manga seem to really like this storyline, and I gave it 2 stars. I think maybe manga is just not my thing. I had a hard time keeping the characters straight because they all kind of look the same to me. Okay, not all of them, but several of them. Like, there's this guy, and then there's a girl that looks almost like him, and then I think there's another, like, guy that pretty much looks like him. There were even multiple, like, metal guys, although they were easier to tell apart. Um, the concept behind this is interesting. It's a little violent. I'm not big into violence. Um, I don't know. It just wasn't my thing. I don't think I'm going to continue on. It took me a long time for this to actually be available at the library. It seems like the early ones are pretty much always out. So I thought I'd give it a try. If you have any recommendations for manga that might be more my taste, I don't like violence. I don't like anything very hypersexualized. I'm thinking maybe manga classics like Eva reads. Maybe that's the best choice for me. But I was not impressed, and I know people really love this, and so I was kind of sad that I didn't. And towards the end, it kind of got a little bit better, but overall, I don't get it. And then the 3 star rated thing that I had this month was actually, it was an Audible original, so I don't know what to call these. They're not quite full-length books, but you get them on Audible, you can put them on your Goodreads, so I'm calling it a book. And that was The Burnout Generation by Anne Helen Peterson. So it was an interesting idea, I guess. She had written an article about burnout as a millennial. Um, and it like struck a chord with a bunch of people, so people kept like emailing her and so forth, and I guess Audible approached her to turn it into something more. So it basically was her having interviews with a number of people. The author herself I found really, really annoying. Um, just she grated on me, and several of the people she interviewed did too. Some of them were pretty good, some of them were just like kind of irritating. The difficulty I had with this is that the author of this, Anne Helen Peterson, seems to think that burnout for millennials is just so vastly like they just experience everything is worse for millennials. Now, I am on the cusp of millennialness myself. I was born in 79, and most of the time millennial starts in like 81. So I can understand a little bit of some of the feelings of some of the millennials that she kind of talked to in this. But basically, rather than saying, okay, millennials are experiencing high rates of burnout, and the reasons that or like how their burnout differs is these things, which would have been very interesting to say, okay, so the things that are contributing to this are, overexposure to social media, expected to always be on because of social media, technology addiction, whatever you wanted to say. Like, there's lots of things that make burnout a little bit different for millennials than, say, Gen Xers, or even more than boomers. But it just was kind of like a cry fest about poor us. Oh, we're burning out. Oh, it's terrible. What can we do? Oh no. And there was a lot of hand wringing, not a lot of solutions, and it just kind of made me a little bit crazy. It had enough good things in it, then I gave it 3 stars, but it was probably pretty close to getting 2 stars. Maybe starting with the worst books is bad because then I get all... Ah. Now we're going to get into my 4-star books. The first one I gave 4 stars, but really, honestly, it's probably more of a 3.5. So we're going to start with that one. And that is Free Range Kids, Giving Our Children the Freedom We Had Without Going Nuts with Worry. This one I've had on my shelves for a long time and I've been meaning to read. It's, a 10-year-old book, so it's nothing new or fascinating. I talk more in depth about this in my nonfiction November wrap-up, which I will put up in the corner. So if you want to hear more about this book or the other nonfiction November books that I'm going to show you, feel free to look at them there. Another one from my nonfiction November was Yarn Remembering the Way Home by Kyoko Mori. This is a memoir, and the memoir is set up kind of around her knitting. So if you want to know more of my thoughts on this one, check that nonfiction November one. I've also been trying to wrap up my Catholic 2019 challenge. I think I still have 3 books to go in the month of December, so it's going to be a rough month. But I did get through a couple of them this month. One of those was The Lamb's Supper, The Mass is Heaven on Earth by Scott Hahn. And I can't remember what challenge this was for. Might have been book written by a Catholic apologist or something like that. This was interesting. I used to think Scott Hahn was pretty challenging reading. And I don't know, I guess I've been reading a lot harder stuff in the past 5 or 6 years. So I didn't find this difficult to read or difficult to understand at all. But basically it is looking at the book of Revelation through the Mass. And it's just so interesting how much of the book of Revelation is in the Mass and how much of the Mass is in the book of Revelation. So this was actually a relatively quick read for me. I gave it 4 stars. It wasn't earth-shattering, but it did have some really interesting points in it. So I would recommend this if you're interested in what the heck is that whole book of Revelation actually about. A fiction book that I kind of started reading in October and finished in November, and now my husband is reading, hence the bookmark, is In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash by Jean Shepherd. Now this book is the book that the movie A Christmas Story is based on or from. There's some significant differences between the movie and this book, however. So A Christmas Story, if you're wondering which Christmas story that is, because it's the most generic title ever, it's the Red Ryder BB gun, you'll shoot your eye out leg lamp movie. So it's a classic that I grew up watching almost every single year, and so I do make my kids watch it a lot. So all of the things, or at least a vast majority of the things from the movie, came from this book. There are no Bumpus Hounds. That was slightly disappointing. And the fuzzy bunny pajamas are just slippers in the book. One of the most distinct differences is that this is actually set in the Depression. And it seems like A Christmas Story is more set in 40s or 50s, somewhere in there. So rather than in the Depression, it's just set later, and the family is a lot better off in the movie than in the book. And then this is just a lot more cynical and wry humor. I really enjoyed this a lot. So the main character is coming back to his little town in Indiana that he grew up in to write an article for his newspaper, and he's on an expense account and everything. And he goes into a bar, and it's the bar that his friend's dad used to own, and lo and behold, his friend from school, his school days, owns the bar now. And they start reminiscing, so it kind of goes back and forth. We'll have a short little chapter with Ralph and Flick having a little conversation in the present, and it'll remind them of something in the past, and so we'll go back and re-experience their childhood in all these stories. There's one particular thing in here that I had to take a picture of and send to my husband, and it's about dynamite and how dynamite is lifeblood to rednecks, and we might have a few rednecks running around out here that like dynamite. Yeah, we we often have explosives at Thanksgiving. This is not my doing, but we have had trap shooting at Thanksgiving. We've had exploding barrels and seeing how high we can get them to go during Thanksgiving. It's a bit of a culture shock for my parents when they happen to be out for this. But so the whole rednecks and dynamite thing, it's just funny. So if you're looking for a funny book, it's not like earth shattering, like you should get at all costs. But if you enjoy a Christmas story and you like kind of wry humor, and are okay with that sort of kind of, it's not a super positive tone, of course. There's Depression era. There's a lot of like, just kind of yuckiness based on that, like people being unemployed, people's possessions being auctioned off, not being able to afford things, but not actually being unusual because everyone around him is the same way. So that is In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash. Going back to my nonfiction November picks, I did read Savage Inequalities, Children in America's Schools by Jonathan Kozol. This is about the public education system and the disparities in it, basically in the 1980s era. So I am looking for a more updated book about the topic because I found this one so fascinating. So if you happen to have any recommendations for books about public education and funding, and quality of schools and that sort of thing, that's a recent book, please let me know in the comments below. I would really love a recommendation for that. And if you want to hear more of my thoughts on it, you can check my nonfiction November wrap-up. This one is probably the highest of my 4 stars, and this was another for my Catholic Challenge for 2019, and that's Lord of the World by Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson. This is a fascinating novel. So it's basically the story of like the end of times. It's dystopian and futuristic, but it was written like 100 years ago. Yeah, first published in 1907. So more than 100 years ago. So things about it didn't age well. Like they have these, instead of like the ways we would travel now, they have like this really kind of complicated system of, I don't know if it's like a combo between a train and a plane. I was never really quite sure how it worked, but it took a long time to get places. And they're like typing letters on typewriters and communicating through telegraph and things like that. So yeah, there's no smartphones in this. But one of the things, I don't know exactly when it's supposed to be set, but one of the laws was passed in like 98, so I assume it's supposed to be like early 2000s. I really should look into when it's actually supposed to be set. But basically, the general plot is that there is this person who comes into prominence politically, and so Catholics, well, religion in general starts to be persecuted, but particularly Catholics. And it kind of ends with the end of time. I think I'm still a little confused by this, but it was really interesting. It's got 2 different perspectives. You go back and forth between a government official in England and a priest from England. So you kind of go back and forth between their perspectives and how they kind of intertwine. It's very interesting. I still really have no idea what I think about it. It's so far beyond me right now. I may have to reread this someday, now that I know the basic thing, to figure out indeed what Monsignor Benson was trying to get at here. And then moving into my 5-star books, the first one was actually an audiobook I listened to, and that was Thick and Other Essays by Tressie McMillan Cottom. This is a series of essays by a sociologist that kind of just revolve around her experiences as a Black woman. So these were fascinating to me. Obviously, I have no experience in being a Black woman, but I do have experience studying sociology, so I really kind of liked the way she worked it into kind of a sociological perspective. Some of the essays were a lot better than others, but overall, I thought they were really great. The one that was like the most painful and the best to me was the one when she talks about, I think it's called Dying for Competency. And it talks about healthcare disparities and the way we perceive people as competent or incompetent based just on their looks alone. Oh, that one was heart wrenching and hit close to home because there was a lot of like medical stuff where like instead of actually looking for the problem, they just said, "Oh, you must just be too fat," and I've experienced that enough times that I at least can feel that one. But she just had it so much worse than I did, even with like experiencing that same kind of fat shamingness in the healthcare industry, just based on the fact that she's a Black woman and I am a white woman. So that one was the best essay in there. But really, overall, I enjoyed all of the essays that she had. I didn't necessarily agree with them all, but she has just a very compelling writing style and very conversational. And the audiobook was really good. This one is from my Read Your Way to Heaven year 2. I still have one more book in that to go as well. So I'm going to try to get that done in December. And it's How the Reformation Happened by Hilaire Block. The person who owned this before me was like a serious marker and like a seriously messy marker. So that was kind of sad for me. I wish they had taken more care with their underlining. I don't mind the underlining, it's the sloppy underlining. But anyway, Hilaire Block just goes through how the Protestant Reformation happened, the historical context, and what is incorrect in the way we are normally taught about the Protestant Reformation, particularly coming from an English context, saying that schools in England teach it this way. And I do think a lot of our American ways of thinking of it come kind of from the British ways of thinking about the Protestant Reformation. So Block is challenging. So this one did challenge me. It was harder to read, but it was still really fascinating. So much to keep track of, so the pre-underlinedness was actually kind of handy for me. Yeah, so I really do recommend Hilaire Block, How the Reformation Happened, if you're interested in hearing kind of the longer explanation than what we generally get of how, like Martin Luther nailed up the 95 Thesis and bam, Protestantism. That's not how it happened. It was much longer, more drawn out, and he also talks about why the response to that was not prompt. So yeah, if you're interested on that, particularly from like a Catholic perspective, because Hilaire Block is Catholic, but he does such good going back and looking at all of the details in this book. Another 5-star book that I had this year was the only fantasy book I read, other than perhaps Lord of the World, which I would call maybe more dystopian. But that was New Spring by Robert Jordan. That is the prequel to The Wheel of Time. And I took a break between book 5 and book 6 to read it. I chose to do it that way because Daniel Green, who does a lot of Wheel of Time content on YouTube, advises that as a good place. Plus, it was a lot smaller, so it was a lot less overwhelming. It's basically the backstory of Moraine and Lan, and how they met and how they kind of started their relationship as Aes Sedai and Warder. And I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed Moraine as a young woman in Swan, I think is how you pronounce it, who is the Amerlin seat in the early Wheel of Time books, and their friendship. It was fun. It was shorter. It was interesting to kind of see the kind of history that culminates in the events that are happening in the Wheel of Time. So I did enjoy that, and I am going to be starting book 6 very soon. And then the last 5-star book, and probably my favorite of the month, was Friday Night Lights, A Town, a Team, and a Dream by H.G. Bissinger. This was also for my nonfiction November TBR. And it is a reread from college. It is an older book. It is also set in a school in the 1980s, late 1980s, early 90s era, which is kind of funny that I had multiple books from about that time talking about stuff in schools. But this one has to do with high school sports. I talk quite a bit more about it in my nonfiction November wrap up. So if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on this one, besides that I thought it was great, 5 stars, definitely recommend, you can check out my wrap up. Thank you so much for hanging out and listening to what I read in the month of November. If you have any questions for me on any of these books or any book suggestions, I would love to hear them, especially if you have a manga series that I could try that might catch my interest more, or if you have a book about the educational system that is a lot more recent than the ones that I have been reading. I would really appreciate that. Feel free to subscribe if you are so inclined, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks.